The origins of the Tupolev SB trace back to the mid-1930s when the Soviet Union sought to overhaul its bomber fleet with faster, more capable aircraft. The Red Army Air Force, aware of rapid technological progress in aviation, recognized that its biplane bombers and slow monoplanes would soon be obsolete against modern fighters and air defenses. The Soviet leadership issued a directive to design a high-speed, all-metal, twin-engine bomber that could outrun enemy interceptors rather than rely solely on defensive armament. Andrei Tupolev's design bureau, renowned for its work on heavy and experimental aircraft, was tasked with developing the new bomber. The challenge was to create a plane capable of carrying a significant payload at speeds surpassing contemporary fighters, a concept that demanded aerodynamic innovation and advanced materials. Early blueprints emphasized a sleek monoplane layout, retractable landing gear, and stressed skin construction, marking a departure from traditional Soviet bomber designs. Engineers experimented with streamlined fuselages and laminar flow wings, integrating two powerful Klimov M100 engines, licensed copies of the French Hispano-Suiza 12Y, to meet performance goals. The development team faced obstacles, including limited experience with such lightweight yet durable airframes, and the Soviet industry's struggle to mass-produce precision components. Still, the urgency of modernization and the government's backing ensured that the design process moved quickly, laying the groundwork for what would become the SB, short for Skorostnoy Bombardirovshchik, or high-speed bomber. The prototype phase for the Tupolev SB marked a critical leap forward in Soviet aviation. The first prototype, designated ANT-40, took to the skies in October 1934, showcasing performance levels that immediately impressed test pilots and officials. With a top speed exceeding 400 km/h, it rivaled or surpassed many contemporary fighters, a remarkable achievement for a bomber of its size and payload capacity. The aircraft's low-wing monoplane configuration, retractable landing gear, and smooth, riveted metal skin represented a technological leap for the Soviet Union, aligning it with global aviation leaders. However, the development process was far from seamless. Early prototypes suffered from structural weaknesses, particularly in the wing roots and fuselage joints, necessitating extensive reinforcement. Engine reliability posed another challenge, as the Klimov M100 engines, though powerful, were prone to overheating and vibration. Test flights revealed issues with stability during dive maneuvers and heavy buffeting at high speeds, prompting aerodynamic refinements to the tail and wing structure. Despite these hurdles, the aircraft's speed and agility earned it rapid approval for series production. By 1935, full-scale manufacturing was underway, with factories in Moscow and Kharkiv adapting to the complexities of producing an all-metal bomber at scale. The ANT-40 designation gave way to the operational name SB, and early production variants were standardized with defensive armament, including nose, dorsal, and ventral machine gun positions. The successful testing phase signaled a shift in Soviet air doctrine, promising a bomber capable not only of delivering ordnance but also of dictating the pace of engagements. The Tupolev SB entered service with the Soviet Air Force in 1936, quickly becoming a symbol of modernization for the Red Army's aviation branch. Its first operational units were deployed to bomber regiments tasked with long-range patrols and strike missions, replacing slower aircraft such as the Tupolev TB-3 in frontline roles. Pilots transitioning to the SB praised its speed and maneuverability, though they noted the cramped crew compartments and demanding handling characteristics at high speeds. The aircraft's debut in combat occurred during the Spanish Civil War, where it was supplied to Republican forces as part of Soviet military aid. In Spain, the SB proved capable of evading most nationalist and German Condor Legion fighters, earning it the nickname Katyusha among its crews for its perceived swiftness and striking power. These early combat sorties demonstrated the bomber's ability to perform daylight raids with relatively low losses, a rare feat for the era. Soviet military leadership took note, accelerating production and deployment across multiple air districts. By the late 1930s, hundreds of SB bombers were in service, and they were increasingly integrated into large-scale exercises that emphasized speed and surprise attacks over traditional mass formations. The aircraft's prominence grew as tensions in Europe and Asia escalated, with the SB becoming the backbone of Soviet tactical bombing capability and a template for future fast bomber designs. Wartime operations placed the Tupolev SB at the center of several key conflicts, testing its adaptability and limitations. In 1938 and 1939, SB units saw extensive action in the battles of Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, where they conducted raids against Japanese positions and logistical hubs. These operations highlighted both the aircraft's strengths and vulnerabilities. While its speed allowed it to penetrate enemy airspace effectively, advances in Japanese fighter tactics and anti-aircraft fire exposed the SB's modest defensive armament and lack of armor protection. The outbreak of World War II and the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 thrust the SB into the most demanding combat environment it would ever face. On the Eastern Front, SB squadrons were deployed en masse for bombing missions against advancing Wehrmacht columns and rear area supply lines. Initially, some formations achieved success through surprise strikes, but the rapid escalation of Luftwaffe fighter presence, particularly Bf 109s, rendered the SB increasingly vulnerable. Losses mounted as German air superiority and mobile flak batteries countered Soviet bombing efforts. Tactical adaptations, including low-level attack profiles and night missions, were introduced to mitigate casualties, but by late 1941, the SB's obsolescence was clear. Newer designs like the Petlyakov PE-2 and Ilyushin Il-4 began replacing it, though SBs continued to fly in secondary roles, including reconnaissance and training through the mid-war years. The evolution of the SB platform produced a range of variants and technical upgrades aimed at extending its relevance. Improved engine installations, such as the M103 and later M105 power plants, increased top speeds and operational ceilings, while refinements to the airframe improved handling and durability. Specialized configurations emerged, including reconnaissance versions with camera equipment, trainers for multi-engine flight instruction, and even experimental adaptations for dive bombing roles. The SB-2M103 became the most widely produced version, benefiting from enhanced aerodynamics and more reliable systems. Efforts to bolster defensive capabilities included upgraded machine guns and, in some instances, rear-facing cannons, though these measures could not fully counter the growing lethality of Axis fighters. Licensed production extended the SB's reach beyond the Soviet Union, with factories in Czechoslovakia manufacturing a derivative known as the B-71. These international builds served both as exports and as training assets for Soviet allies. The continuous evolution of the design underscored the Soviet Union's attempts to bridge the gap between interwar aviation concepts and the demands of total war, even as newer bombers rendered the SB increasingly obsolete by the early 1940s. The Tupolev SB's global impact and legacy extended beyond its direct combat record. During its peak years, it was exported or supplied to several nations, including China, Mongolia, and Spain, where it significantly enhanced the aerial capabilities of recipient forces. Its design influenced subsequent Soviet bombers, particularly in the areas of aerodynamics, production techniques, and the concept of high-speed strike aircraft. For the Soviet Air Force, the SB marked a pivotal transition from slow, heavily armed bombers to the fast, precision-oriented doctrine that would define its approach through the early stages of World War II. Although rapidly outclassed by newer aircraft, the SB's widespread deployment and pioneering performance left a lasting imprint on Soviet aviation strategy and industrial practices. Today, few examples survive, primarily as static displays in aviation museums across Russia and Eastern Europe. These preserved airframes stand as reminders of an aircraft that, while overshadowed by later designs, played a transformative role in preparing the Soviet Union for the aerial challenges of the late 1930s and early 1940s. Among the lesser-known chapters of the Tupolev SB's history are its post-combat and experimental roles, which reveal the adaptability of the platform even after its frontline retirement. Some SBs were converted for research purposes, including trials as remote-controlled target drones and engine testbeds. Others served as improvised transports or weather reconnaissance aircraft, operating in remote regions where newer planes were unavailable. A handful of proposals explored converting the SB into a light torpedo bomber for naval aviation, though these never progressed beyond prototype stages due to the airframe's limitations at low altitudes. Anecdotal accounts from veteran ground crews and pilots suggest that despite its vulnerabilities in the face of modern fighters, the SB earned respect for its reliability and straightforward maintenance, qualities that prolonged its utility in secondary roles well into the war. These overlooked facets of its service underscore the aircraft's versatility and the ingenuity of Soviet engineers and crews in maximizing the utility of a design that had, at its inception, redefined the speed and capability of bombers in the 1930s. The prototype phase for the Tupolev SB marked a decisive turning point in Soviet aviation, demonstrating how far the country's industry had advanced since the early 1930s. The first prototype, designated ANT-40, achieved its maiden flight in October 1934, immediately surpassing the expectations of the Red Army Air Force. Its performance was groundbreaking for a twin-engine bomber, reaching speeds in excess of 400 kilometers per hour, which rivaled or even exceeded the capabilities of several contemporary fighter aircraft. This speed advantage was a deliberate design choice, allowing the SB to evade interception rather than rely solely on defensive armament. The aircraft featured a low-wing monoplane layout, fully retractable landing gear, and a smooth, stressed metal skin, all of which represented major technological leaps for Soviet designers. These features demanded entirely new production processes, as most Soviet factories had only recently transitioned from fabric-covered biplanes and mixed construction airframes to all-metal structures. The development process was not without serious difficulties. Early prototypes revealed structural weaknesses, particularly in the wing spars and fuselage joints, where aerodynamic stress at high speeds risked catastrophic failure. These issues led to a series of design reinforcements, adding weight but preserving the aircraft's core performance. The Klimov M100 engines, derived from the French Hispano-Suiza 12Y, provided the necessary power but proved temperamental, suffering from overheating and persistent vibration during extended runs. Engineers refined the cooling systems, strengthened engine mounts, and redesigned the cowlings to improve airflow and serviceability. Flight tests also uncovered stability concerns during dives and sharp maneuvers, with heavy buffeting threatening crew control at maximum speeds. Aerodynamic refinements, including a reshaped tail assembly and slight adjustments to the wing dihedral, were introduced to address these shortcomings. Despite the setbacks, the prototype's speed and agility were so revolutionary that state approval for mass production came swiftly. In 1935, serial manufacturing commenced at major aviation plants in Moscow and Kharkiv, requiring rapid retraining of workers and the introduction of precision tooling to accommodate the SB's riveted metal construction. The ANT-40 designation was soon replaced by the operational name SB, short for Skorostnoy Bombardirovshchik, meaning high-speed bomber. Production models featured a defensive armament suite, including nose, dorsal, and ventral machine gun positions, giving the three-man crew at least some capability to respond to attacks from multiple directions. These refinements, combined with its unprecedented speed, positioned the SB as a cornerstone of the Soviet modernization effort. The successful transition from prototype to production not only provided the Red Army Air Force with a cutting-edge bomber, but also laid the industrial and technological foundation for future Soviet combat aircraft that would emerge as global conflicts escalated. The Tupolev SB entered active service with the Soviet Air Force in 1936, ushering in a new era for Soviet tactical and strategic aviation. Its deployment marked a significant leap forward from the obsolete biplane bombers that had dominated the Red Army's inventory. The first SB-equipped regiments were formed within the long-range bomber aviation units, tasked with high-speed bombing and reconnaissance roles, and they quickly became the pride of the Soviet Air Force. Pilots who transitioned to the SB were immediately struck by its speed, which exceeded that of many frontline fighters of the period, as well as by its relatively modern instrumentation and flight controls. However, crews also noted the demanding nature of the aircraft, particularly at high speeds and during low-level attack runs, where the aircraft's responsive handling left little margin for error. Despite its challenges, the SB's cutting-edge design made it a symbol of Soviet progress and a visible deterrent to potential adversaries during a time of growing geopolitical tension. The SB's first combat experience came not in Soviet skies but over Spain, where the aircraft was exported to support Republican forces during the Spanish Civil War. Between 1936 and 1938, dozens of SB bombers were supplied to Republican units as part of Moscow's military aid program. In Spain, the SB quickly earned a reputation for its ability to conduct daylight bombing raids with minimal losses, a feat virtually unattainable for other bombers of the era. Nicknamed Katyusha by its crews for its speed and reliability, the aircraft outpaced most of the Condor Legion's fighters during its initial sorties, giving Republican forces a much-needed edge. Its success in Spain validated Soviet doctrine that prioritized speed over heavy defensive weaponry, proving that a bomber could rely on velocity as its primary means of survival. These operational lessons influenced both tactical deployment and ongoing production refinements, as Soviet engineers took note of battlefield feedback to improve armament placement and crew ergonomics. By the late 1930s, the SB had become the backbone of Soviet bomber aviation. Thousands were produced, equipping bomber divisions across multiple military districts, from the European theater to the Far East. The aircraft played a central role in large-scale military exercises designed to demonstrate the Red Army's modern capabilities to both domestic audiences and foreign observers. Soviet leadership viewed the SB not only as a practical weapon, but also as a political statement, a symbol that the Soviet Union was capable of fielding advanced, homegrown aircraft at a time when global air power was rapidly evolving. As tensions with Japan grew in the Far East and with Nazi Germany in Europe, SB units were kept on heightened alert, patrolling borders and rehearsing deep strike operations intended to disrupt enemy supply and communication lines. Operational integration was not without challenges. The SB's high speed and complex systems required intensive pilot and crew training, as well as significant logistical support for maintenance and engine servicing. Soviet training programs expanded rapidly to accommodate the influx of new aircrew, while factories struggled to keep up with the demand for spare parts, especially for the temperamental M100 engines. Nevertheless, the aircraft's presence in growing numbers gave the Soviet Air Force a level of flexibility and reach it had previously lacked. By 1939, as the world edged closer to global war, the SB was a central pillar of Soviet air strategy, its performance inspiring confidence that the USSR could project power from the skies across Europe and Asia when conflict inevitably erupted. Wartime operations would reveal both the promise and the fragility of the Tupolev SB, as it became one of the most widely used Soviet bombers during the early stages of multiple conflicts. The aircraft first saw major state-on-state combat during the border clashes with Japan, particularly at Lake Khasan in 1938 and Khalkhin Gol in 1939. SB squadrons carried out strikes against Japanese positions, supply depots, and troop concentrations, often operating deep beyond front lines thanks to their superior range and speed. While these raids inflicted considerable damage and demonstrated the aircraft's ability to penetrate hostile airspace, the engagements also exposed its weaknesses. Japanese fighters, notably the Nakajima Ki-27, began to catch up with the SB during extended engagements, exploiting its relatively light defensive armament and unarmored fuel tanks. Anti-aircraft fire also proved increasingly deadly, as the SB's lack of armor and self-sealing tanks left it vulnerable during low-altitude attacks. These lessons, while costly, pushed Soviet tacticians to experiment with new bombing profiles, including higher altitude runs and the first coordinated escort fighter missions for SB formations. The true test of the SB came with the outbreak of the Second World War, and in particular Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. At the time of the German invasion, the SB represented a substantial share of the Soviet bomber fleet, with thousands in service across the western military districts. During the first weeks of the war, SB bombers were thrown into near-continuous action, conducting daylight raids against advancing Wehrmacht columns, railway hubs, and logistical convoys. Initially, some missions achieved tactical successes, striking unprotected troop concentrations or disrupting supply lines. However, the rapid establishment of Luftwaffe air superiority on the Eastern Front soon turned the SB's speed advantage into an inadequate defense. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 quickly closed the performance gap, and the SB's defensive machine guns, though improved in later versions, could not compensate for the lack of armor or escort coverage. Loss rates soared, with some bomber regiments losing more than half of their operational aircraft within weeks of the invasion. These staggering losses forced a tactical rethinking of the SB's use. Crews began employing low-level attack profiles to evade radar and enemy fighters, using terrain masking to reach targets with minimal exposure. Night missions also became increasingly common, taking advantage of the bomber's relatively stable handling in darkness, even at the expense of bombing accuracy. While these adaptations prolonged the SB's combat utility, they did little to alter the reality that by 1942 the aircraft was outclassed in nearly every respect by the rapidly evolving air war. New Soviet designs such as the Petlyakov Pe-2, Yakovlev Yak-4, and the long-range Ilyushin Il-4 began to replace the SB in frontline bomber regiments, offering superior speed, range, defensive capabilities, and payload capacity. Despite its declining role on the front lines, the SB remained a valuable tool for the Soviet war effort in secondary capacities. Many surviving airframes were converted into reconnaissance aircraft, leveraging their range and speed for intelligence-gathering missions in relatively low-threat sectors. Others became advanced trainers, introducing new generations of Soviet aircrews to multi-engine flight before transitioning to more modern combat types. In partisan-controlled territories and rear-area theaters, SBs continued to carry out harassment raids, supply drops, and targeted strikes, contributing to Soviet operations even as their design became increasingly antiquated. By the time Germany's eastern campaigns reached their most intense stages, the SB's days as a premier combat aircraft were over, but its widespread service and adaptability had ensured it remained a fixture of Soviet aviation through some of the most difficult years of the war. The evolution of the Tupolev SB during its years of production was marked by a series of significant modifications, each intended to extend its viability as warfare and aviation technology advanced. From its initial production model powered by the Klimov M100 engines, the aircraft underwent multiple upgrades in an effort to remain competitive with the rapid advancements of Axis air power. The first major development was the integration of the M103 engine, which increased top speed to over 450 kilometers per hour and improved service ceiling, though this came at the cost of slightly higher fuel consumption and added strain on airframes already pushed to their limits. These performance gains, while welcome, could not fully bridge the widening gap between the SB and the latest fighters it now faced. Nonetheless, they allowed the bomber to retain some operational value during the early stages of the German-Soviet conflict, particularly in missions over secondary fronts or at night. As combat experience accumulated, engineers focused on adapting the SB to specialized roles beyond standard-level bombing. Reconnaissance variants became increasingly important, equipped with camera installations and extended fuel tanks, enabling deep penetration intelligence flights over contested areas. These versions often flew without full defensive armament to save weight, relying on speed and altitude for survival. Trainer variants also became essential to Soviet pilot education, offering hands-on experience with twin-engine performance before transitioning to more complex or powerful aircraft like the Pe-2 or Il-4 taunt efforts were even made to convert some SBs for dive bombing roles with strengthened airframes and modified bomb release systems, though these experiments never saw large-scale adoption due to the inherent structural risks and the arrival of purpose-built dive bombers better suited to the task. Defensive improvements were another focal point as the SB's vulnerabilities became evident. Later production runs incorporated heavier and more reliable machine guns, including the 12.7mm Berezin UBT, replacing lighter HKAS guns in dorsal and ventral positions. Armored plating was added around the cockpit and fuel tanks, and self-sealing fuel cells were gradually introduced on certain variants. While these changes marginally improved survivability, they also added weight, reducing some of the aircraft's original speed advantage, its most critical defensive asset. Attempts to balance protection with performance often ended with only partial success, leaving the SB increasingly relegated to secondary combat roles as newer designs entered full service. Internationally, the SB also extended its reach through licensed production and export. Czechoslovakia produced its own derivative, the Avia B-71, which was supplied in limited numbers to Soviet allies and satellite states. China, engaged in the Second Sino-Japanese War, received several SB bombers directly from Soviet stocks, where they were used extensively in raids against Japanese forces in Manchuria and along the Yangtze River. These export and license-built versions broadened the SB's operational footprint, contributing to conflicts far beyond the Soviet Union's immediate theaters and cementing its reputation as a capable, if increasingly dated, combat platform by the early 1940s. Despite the steady introduction of more advanced Soviet bombers, production of SB variants continued into the early war years due to the sheer demand for aircraft and the familiarity of factories with its design. By the time its production ceased, tens of thousands of aircrew had trained or flown combat sorties in the type, making it one of the most widely operated Soviet bombers of its generation. Though its combat peak had passed, the evolutionary path of the SB highlighted the Soviet Union's determination to adapt and repurpose its air assets, keeping even aging designs relevant in the face of rapidly changing battlefield realities. These variants and upgrades reflected a pragmatic approach to warfare, ensuring that the SB, despite its obsolescence, remained a useful tool until fully replaced by faster, more survivable aircraft designed with lessons from its career firmly in mind. The Tupolev SB's broader impact and legacy reached far beyond its years as a frontline combat aircraft, influencing both the Soviet aviation industry and the doctrines of multiple nations during a transformative era of air warfare. At its peak in the late 1930s, the SB represented the Soviet Union's most advanced and widely fielded bomber, a symbol of industrial progress and a harbinger of the transition from interwar aviation to the realities of modern combat. Its export to foreign air forces extended its influence even further. Republican Spain relied heavily on the SB during the Spanish Civil War, where it gave the Republican Air Force a brief technological edge against nationalist forces, allowing for daring daylight bombing raids that few other aircraft of the era could attempt without catastrophic losses. In China, the SB became a valuable asset during the Second Sino-Japanese War, where it participated in raids on Japanese supply lines, troop concentrations, and urban targets. In both cases, the aircraft demonstrated the strategic advantage of speed-oriented bombers, reinforcing a shift in Air Force thinking globally. For the Soviet Union, the SB left a profound legacy in how it reshaped manufacturing practices and tactical doctrine. Its production forced Soviet factories to modernize, introducing large-scale precision metalworking, riveted airframe assembly, and the complex logistics needed to sustain high-output production of all-metal aircraft. These lessons directly contributed to the successful mass production of later more advanced bombers like the PE-2 and Il-4. Doctrinally, the SB's operational history highlighted both the strengths and shortcomings of relying primarily on speed for bomber survivability. While it performed exceptionally in conflicts where enemy fighters were slower or less numerous, its vulnerability against modern interceptors in World War II underscored the need for a balanced approach that included escorts, improved defensive armament, and eventually better protected airframes. Culturally and historically, the SB remains a landmark design, emblematic of the Soviet Union's rapid industrial and military ascent during the late interwar period. Today, surviving examples can be found in a handful of aviation museums across Russia and Eastern Europe, preserved as testaments to an aircraft that, for a brief but pivotal time, set new standards for bomber performance. These displays often highlight the SB's sleek design and innovative features, serving as reminders of how quickly aviation technology evolved in the years leading up to and during the Second World War. For historians and enthusiasts, the SB is viewed not just as a weapon of war, but as a catalyst, an aircraft that bridged the gap between the slower, more cumbersome bombers of the early 1930s and the fast, versatile strike aircraft that would dominate the skies in the decade to come. Its legacy endures as a reflection of both the ambition and limitations of 1930s aviation, a design that, despite being eclipsed by wartime advances, fundamentally altered the trajectory of Soviet and global bomber development. Among the lesser-known aspects of the Tupolev SB's career are its post-combat uses, experimental adaptations, and forgotten missions, which extended the aircraft's relevance long after its frontline role had ended. Following its rapid replacement by more advanced designs like the Petlyakov PE-2 and Ilyushin Il-4, the SB was repurposed for a wide range of secondary and experimental roles across the Soviet Union. Many surviving airframes became research and development platforms, with some converted into flying laboratories for testing new engines, propeller systems, and aerodynamic modifications. Others were fitted with experimental autopilot systems or adapted as remote-controlled target drones, allowing Soviet anti-aircraft crews to practice with live maneuvering targets. While these roles rarely received the same recognition as the SB's combat service, they reflected the aircraft's structural resilience and adaptability, proving useful for technical innovations that would influence Soviet aviation beyond the war. The SB also played unexpected roles in logistical and support operations. Converted examples served as cargo transports in remote regions, carrying supplies to isolated outposts in Siberia and Central Asia, where newer transport aircraft were scarce. Some were even adapted as weather reconnaissance platforms, collecting atmospheric data crucial for planning large-scale air and ground operations. Though the SB was never designed for these purposes, its robust range and relatively simple maintenance made it an effective stopgap solution in theaters where resources were stretched thin. There were also proposals to modify the SB into a light torpedo bomber for naval aviation, a concept tested with prototype aircraft fitted with reinforced hardpoints and flotation gear. However, these efforts were ultimately abandoned, as the airframe's performance at low altitudes and over water proved insufficient compared to specialized naval bombers then entering development. Beyond its technical and logistical repurposing, the SB left behind a legacy shaped by the recollections of those who flew and maintained it. Surviving accounts from veteran pilots and ground crews describe the aircraft as demanding but trustworthy, a machine that required precision and discipline but rewarded skilled handling. Its speed, while less formidable by the 1940s, was considered a point of pride by those who remembered its heyday in Spain, and during the border conflicts with Japan, many crews recalled the SB as an aircraft that gave them a sense of parity with, or even superiority over, their adversaries before the technological surge of World War II rendered it outmatched. These reflections contribute to the enduring image of the SB as a transitional aircraft, one that represented the peak of Soviet bomber innovation in the late 1930s while also highlighting the pace at which military aviation evolved. Today, only a handful of SB airframes survive, preserved in museums and private collections. Most are static displays, restored to represent the sleek lines and clean profiles that once embodied Soviet technological ambition. These remnants, though few, allow modern audiences to appreciate the aircraft's significance not merely as a combat tool, but as a technological milestone. For aviation historians, the SB stands as a case study in how a revolutionary design can rise to prominence, dominate its era, and yet be rendered obsolete within a few short years by the relentless progress of military aviation. Its forgotten missions, experimental roles, and the respect it earned from those who worked with it ensure that, while overshadowed by the bombers that followed, the Tupolev SB remains a symbol of a crucial turning point in the development of 20th century air power. Although the Tupolev SB is most often remembered for its rapid obsolescence during the early stages of World War II, its legacy lies equally in what it revealed about the transition between interwar aviation concepts and the demands of total war. When first introduced in 1936, the SB embodied a revolutionary philosophy. Speed was to be its armor, allowing it to evade fighters and reduce reliance on heavy defensive weapons or thick armor plating. For a brief period, this concept proved effective, as few adversaries could match its velocity, and its streamlined design allowed for bold daylight raids that older bombers could not attempt without devastating losses. However, by 1941, the evolution of fighter aircraft, particularly the German Bf-109 and later the FW-190, rendered the SB's speed advantage moot, exposing how quickly pre-war aviation doctrines could become outdated. The SB's combat record therefore became a cautionary tale for air planners, demonstrating the risks of relying on single design philosophies in a rapidly advancing technological environment. Despite its eventual shortcomings, the SB played a critical role in shaping the Soviet Union's understanding of mass-produced, high-performance military aviation. Its large-scale production forced Soviet industry to modernize at an accelerated pace, introducing practices such as precision riveting, aerodynamic stress testing, and assembly line standardization for complex airframes. These innovations laid the groundwork for the production of more advanced aircraft during the war, ensuring that the Red Army Air Force could field competitive bombers and fighters despite the devastating losses of 1941-42. In this way, the SB served as a bridge between the experimental aircraft of the early 1930s and the rugged, combat-proven designs that would dominate the latter years of the war. Internationally, the SB's export and license-built versions demonstrated the global appeal of its design, even as its effectiveness waned. Nations such as Spain, China, and Mongolia used the SB or its derivatives well into the early 1940s, in some cases fighting opponents who lacked modern fighters or radar-guided defenses, where the aircraft could still be effective. In these contexts, the SB prolonged its operational relevance, delivering strategic and tactical advantages to air forces with fewer technological resources. Its widespread deployment across multiple continents made it one of the most recognizable Soviet aircraft of its generation, a status that few pre-war designs achieved. For veterans and historians alike, the SB remains emblematic of an era defined by both innovation and instability. Pilots who trained on or fought in the SB often described it as demanding but rewarding, a machine that required a skilled hand but inspired confidence in its ability to complete missions when handled properly. Ground crews appreciated its relatively straightforward maintenance compared to heavier, more complex bombers, a factor that contributed to its longevity in secondary roles. These practical attributes, combined with its historical significance, have helped preserve its reputation even as later, more successful aircraft overshadowed it in public memory. Today, the Tupolev SB endures as more than just a relic of Soviet aviation history. It is studied as a key transitional design that bridged two radically different phases of military aviation. Museums and restoration projects highlight not only its sleek lines and once formidable performance, but also its role in propelling Soviet industry and doctrine forward during a turbulent period. Though largely absent from the skies after 1943, the SB's story is essential to understanding how the Soviet Union, and by extension, global air forces, adapted to the unforgiving pace of technological change in the lead-up to and during the Second World War. Its existence and service record remain a testament to both the ambition and the impermanence of cutting-edge designs in the rapidly shifting theater of 20th-century air combat. One of the most overlooked dimensions of the Tupolev SB's history lies in the transitional role it played for both technology and the people who operated it, as it bridged the gap between a generation of slow, cumbersome bombers and the fast, purpose-built strike aircraft that followed. For the Soviet aviation industry, the SB became a proving ground not only for new aerodynamic concepts, but also for the workforce that would later produce the PE-2, IL-4, and Tu-2. Workers, engineers, and managers who had cut their teeth on the SB's complex, all-metal construction carried their expertise into subsequent programs, directly influencing the Soviet Union's ability to mass-produce modern combat aircraft under the pressures of wartime demand. The techniques developed for the SB, ranging from stress-tested monocoque structures to streamlined mass assembly, helped standardize production practices across a sector that had, only a few years prior, relied heavily on labor-intensive, mixed-construction aircraft. In many ways, the SB's industrial legacy outlived its operational prime, becoming an indirect but crucial factor in sustaining Soviet air power during the war's critical years. For the air crews, the SB also became a stepping stone, shaping the skills and tactics of the bomber force before the transition to newer types. Pilots learned to handle an aircraft whose speed and responsiveness demanded precise control, a stark departure from the forgiving, sluggish platforms of earlier designs. Navigators and gunners, meanwhile, had to adapt to the realities of coordinating missions at higher speeds and altitudes, developing techniques for target acquisition and defensive coverage that would later be refined aboard more advanced bombers. Even after its withdrawal from primary combat roles, the SB remained central to Soviet pilot and crew training pipelines, giving thousands of airmen experience with twin-engine flight, complex systems, and formation tactics before they moved on to frontline aircraft. This indirect contribution meant that, despite its dwindling effectiveness in battle, the SB continued to bolster the Red Army Air Force's capabilities through the training of skilled personnel. The SB's operational career also underscores the pace of obsolescence that characterized military aviation in the late 1930s and early 1940s. When it first entered service, it was faster than most fighters in existence and embodied the cutting edge of bomber design. Yet within 5 years, the very traits that had made it formidable, speed and minimal defensive weight, became liabilities as fighter performance surged and anti-aircraft weapons improved. This rapid shift highlights a core lesson that militaries worldwide would internalize. Aircraft design philosophies could not remain static, and assumptions about survivability based on current technology could become dangerously outdated in a matter of months. For Soviet designers, the SB's decline served as both a warning and a foundation, encouraging the pursuit of more versatile designs that balance speed, firepower, and protection rather than relying on a single advantage. Though few SBs survived beyond the mid-war years, their legacy persisted through their indirect influences and the memories of those who flew them. Veterans often recalled the SB with a sense of respect, noting that while it demanded discipline, it also gave Soviet crews a sense of confidence during its prime, confidence that the Red Army Air Force could compete with and even overmatch its adversaries in the skies, at least before the Luftwaffe's dominance reshaped the air war. This psychological and tactical bridge, along with its industrial and training roles, ensured that the SB's place in history was secured not merely by its combat record, but by the lasting foundations it built for Soviet air power in one of the most turbulent periods in aviation history. The final chapter of the Tupolev SB's story reflects its transformation from a revolutionary frontline weapon into a historical artifact, a symbol of the breakneck pace of aviation progress before and during World War II. By 1943, the aircraft had all but disappeared from active combat roles, relegated to secondary duties such as training, reconnaissance, transport, and experimental use. Yet its widespread service in earlier years had left an indelible mark on both the Soviet Air Force and global aviation. For the USSR, the SB's career provided essential experience in producing, operating, and supporting large fleets of advanced twin-engine aircraft, knowledge that would later underpin the success of wartime bombers like the PE-2 and Tu-2. For foreign operators, including Republican Spain, China, and Mongolia, the SB represented a rare infusion of modern striking power at a time when many nations' air forces were still anchored in older, slower designs, granting them temporary parity or even superiority in localized conflicts. After the war, the few surviving SBs found themselves either scrapped or preserved as museum pieces, their sleek, streamlined profiles serving as reminders of how advanced they had once seemed. In Russia and several Eastern European countries, restored examples stand in aviation museums, often alongside their successors, illustrating the evolutionary steps in Soviet aircraft design. These exhibits not only commemorate the SB's role in combat, but also highlight its broader historical significance as the first Soviet bomber to match and, for a short time, surpass the performance of contemporary fighters. Its introduction had signaled the USSR's ability to field competitive, homegrown aircraft on the global stage, a capability that would become vital as the Second World War unfolded. For aviation historians, the SB embodies a transitional period where doctrines and designs were tested against rapidly shifting technological and tactical realities. Its initial success validated the idea that speed could serve as a bomber's primary defense, a concept that influenced not only Soviet aircraft but also designs in other nations during the late 1930s. However, its eventual vulnerability underscored the shortcomings of relying on a single attribute for survivability, a lesson that shaped post-1941 bomber development. The PE-2, Il-4, and Tu-2, all products of the industrial and doctrinal groundwork laid by the SB, reflected this shift toward more balanced aircraft, incorporating improved armament, armor, and versatility. The Tupolev SB also holds a unique cultural and symbolic legacy. For Soviet citizens and servicemen of the late 1930s, it stood as a symbol of modernity and national strength, a highly visible testament to the USSR's rapid industrial and military rise. For veterans, its memory often carries a dual character: pride in what it represented during its prime, tempered by the sobering reality of its heavy losses once the war exposed its limitations. This duality contributes to its enduring place in aviation history, not as a perfect aircraft, but as one that epitomized both the promise and perils of rapid technological leaps. Ultimately, the SB's story is less about its demise than about its role as a catalyst for change. It accelerated the Soviet Union's entry into the modern era of bomber aviation, trained generations of aircrews, and laid the industrial and doctrinal foundations for the aircraft that would carry the USSR through the Second World War. Though overshadowed by the planes that followed, the Tupolev SB remains a landmark achievement of its time, remembered not only for its brief dominance of the skies, but also for the transformative impact it had on the evolution of Soviet and global air power.